How you doing, Sophia? What are you doing here? Isn't this a guitar practice? Oh, this you spoke, we listen. Oh, okay, I knew there's a reason I was supposed to be here. Well, hey, everybody. Post-pandemic Dan here. I'm still trying to figure out where I'm supposed to be again. But I'm here to talk to you about our You Spoke, We Listened session that we do every now and then when we are ready to tell you what we were able to implement based on suggestions that you've given to us over the past year or so. And so, you wanted somebody besides me to start giving presentations. Less work for me. So now you'll be able to see Michael Hartkey, Adam Reynolds, Sean Waugh, and other people from the company delivering content as part of our education program. The second thing is that you wanted to have shorter movies. And one of my clients put it this way, hey, keep the drill downs coming. There's nothing wrong with the 1 hour presentations, but can you give us something that we can show in our committee meetings? And so the last movie that I was involved in was on insurance review for your incident response plan, and it was only 8 minutes long. So I think we're delivering on that. You're seeing some short movies out there. Finally, several of our clients came to us and said, hey, the movies.infotex.com page is great because there's so many movies on them, but there's no method to the madness. They're just kind of a hodgepodge of movies about various subjects. Can you organize them? Well, they actually are organized. They're in chronological order, and we want to keep that going because we want you to know how old the information is that we're providing. So what we did do, though, is we created playlists.infotex.com, which organize our movies based on what type of process they belong to. So the access management movies are all in one place, the risk management movies in another, the strategic planning in another, vendor management in another. And so check out playlist.infotex.com, especially if you have one of those entry-level employees who are saying, yeah, sure, I'd be interested in taking on vendor management, right? Because you could send them the playlist.infotex.com and say, hey, watch the dozen or so movies that are in the vendor management playlist there, and then come back and talk to me about taking on vendor management. Thank you. I do think I have a guitar practice later today, and as you can tell, I need to work a little bit on my Neil Young, so back to that, I guess.
When you view an infotex, webinar, or movie, you do so with 4 caveats. First, you are agreeing to the terms posted at the webpage listed on this slide. Second, our lawyers want you to know that what Infotex presents is often time-dated or about new trends, regulations, or guidance, and therefore we cannot provide this material with any warranty whatsoever. Thirdly, material provided with Infotex webinars and movies is copyrighted. You keep the copyright to material customized to your organization, but Infotex reserves the right to use the material in other engagements and boilerplates. See our Transfer of Copyright Agreement at the webpage listed in the slide. Finally, those who view our webinars or movies may be added to an email mailing list. If you do not wish to receive notice of additional educational opportunities, please accept our apologies and please opt out at the webpage shown on the slide.
Hello, partners. Cowhand Dan here, dressed as a miner. Out camping with my friends Jane and Joe Iso. They're good friends of mine, and we like sitting around. Oh, you know what I just realized? You might not be able to see me very well. Let me stand it on up here. So is that a little better? What I was saying is that I'm out camping with my friends Jane and Joe Iso, and we like getting around the campfire and talking about things like cyber poetry and technology planning. But suffice it to say, for 7 to 10 years now. If you can find it on m7.infotex.com, by the way, but I've been writing these annual trend articles, listing or reviewing the top 7 trends that small bank and credit union IT departments are facing as they write their technology plans. And as an auditor, I'm really big on making sure that the management team and not the IT people or the ISO write the technology plan. So I've learned to use a lot of metaphors to help management understand the technologies and the concepts around technology planning in my trend article. And so suffice it to say, this talk is kind of a collection of metaphors, usually surrounding the Western theme. So back in the olden days, which could be 1849, given that it's kind of like 2021, at least from a crypto perspective, but back in those days, cowboys and miners and in my case, cowhands, would gather around campfires and share songs and stories and poetry and who knows, maybe even technology plans. And so this talk is really a metaphor for what needs to happen with the IT teams in small banks and credit unions. You need to have a campfire talk with management. We're at a crossroads now, and our plans for the next 3 to 5 years are going to be extremely important. We really need to do a good job at it now. And so the first metaphor, besides the talk itself and the fact that we need to have a discussion with management, is the metaphor of Joe and Jane ISO in the first place. They're cybersecurity superheroes. You see, in 2020, during the depth of a pandemic, community banks and credit unions experienced less than 1% of the data breached. Yep, the Verizon data breach report shows that us prospectors have been kicking butt, knock on wood. We've been lickety-split, and that is amazing. Joe and Jane represent the IT folk in the bank, the cybersecurity superheroes. They do a lot with very little. They don't have minions of cybersecurity expertise like the Fortune 500 companies that keep getting breached, by the way. They just work hard, respond to audit findings, and discuss best practices like Jane and Joe here around a campfire whenever possible. Joe and Jane represent you as you work to help your management team and not you write your technology plan. They need to consider these trends. You might even want them to watch this movie. And so, regarding Joe and Jane ISO, imagine what it would be like if when your management team set out the bat signal to call Joe and Jane ISO to their, bank, corporate office or whatever, because they need help writing their technology plan. What would it be like if instead of Joe and Jane, a couple of cowboys showed up, right? Or cowgirl and a cowboy, or cow persons, cowhands. What would it be like, right? Now, I wasn't called Cowhand Dan until the depths of the 2020 pandemic, when prospectors were getting fed up and tired of virtual conferences. And I moderate conferences. Now, this one association had already seen me moderate a conference as a pirate, a virtual conference as a pirate, because that made it at least a little funner. And so they asked if I could moderate their conference as a cowboy. And I said, I'm not a gunslinger. And they said, don't worry about it. You just need to get in front of the screen with a cowboy hat. And so I did. Well, they also wanted me to give a talk on trends. And so I showed them my article, The Magnificent Seven, and they liked it. And the rest is history. Next thing you know, I'm talking to my mom. Yeah. I mean, if you have to talk to your mom about a talk, yeah. And so I'm explaining, Mom, I really don't see myself as a cowboy. I'm just not the cowboy type. And she's like, what do you mean? What do you mean, Dan? I mean, you're probably the only person who's actually ran cattle. And I thought, yeah, good point. I mean, I wasn't a cowboy. And the next day she has my sister email me this picture here. And the email said, Dan, Mom wants you to know that you're probably the only person that's run cattle on a horse. And, here's my horse, Polky. This is what I looked like in the 70s, by the way. And, my dog, Nicky, by the way, didn't always ride on the horse. It took 2 weeks for us to get the pictures back just to know if this worked, right? Back in those days, in the 70s, we didn't have digital photography. But suffice it to say, the reason this whole talk is dressed up to look like, a belt down at the bottom here with the ISO, belt buckle in it and that sort of thing, is because I'm a cowhand, not a gunslinger. That's the main thing I guess I kind of learned. And by the way, the whole language of cowhands really kind of lends itself to cybersecurity. I mean, think about it, circling the wagons. I mean, what are we talking about there? Is that technology risk management, or is that decreasing our attack surface, right? Desperados are the bad guy hackers, whereas prospectors, you could say they're bankers, right? They're the good guys. I'm not talking mega trends, the stuff that trend experts would be talking about. I'm not a trend expert. I'm not even talking about these big technology trends. I mean, community-based banks don't need to be concerned with space exploration or biotech, though we do need to start looking into what our vendors are doing with artificial intelligence. I don't know a lot of banks that are putting quantum computers. I mean, some of the fraud, monitoring software might require quantum computing, but, and obviously space exploration is a little bit over our pay grade, I think. But cybersecurity is definitely a big technology trend that banks are, and everybody in the whole world is facing. But I'm talking about community bank technology trends that can be used for technology planning, that we should keep aware of as we walk through the technology planning process, however that's evolved in your bank. And I really hope it's evolved to a point where it truly is the management team and not just the operations part of the management team. I'm talking about the entire management team. I'm talking about the people that write your business plans. They should be writing your technology plan. And so we want to put them all on the same page about what's going on. And so if we can come up with a list of 7 trends that can be reduced to 1 sentence, wow, now that's what I'm talking about. And so, I like to have catchy titles to my blog posts and that sort of thing. And so I was thinking, what's kind of neat about the movie, The Magnificent Seven, is that these 7 gunslingers here were hired to protect the town against this guy and his gang. And guess what these guys realized before the movie was over? Well, they realized that the only way we're going to be able to protect this town is to teach the townspeople to protect themselves. And guess what? Isn't that what you do? Isn't that what you do as a living? If you're an information security officer, if you wear this belt buckle, you're in the business of teaching users how to protect themselves. And so I felt like that made a good, metaphor for the article. I've been using it ever since. And so now you know why I call the 7 trends the Magnificent Seven. And, we took a good 10 minutes explaining that. Let's go ahead and dive into the first trend, which I feel is best illustrated like this, okay? See, here's Joe and Jane. They're sitting around a campfire, right? And so the first trend can be illustrated like this. See that? Now you see them, now you don't. And that's because I call the first trend the disappearance. And I've been actually writing about this. This has been on the trend list for a few years now. Really kind of started when our virtual servers, when our servers were disappearing from our racks, right? But, it didn't take us long to put in VDE environments and, cloud applications are now, causing us to not have to install stuff on our servers anymore. And so the servers are disappearing even more. And so it's all disappearing. Now, Sophia is the person that does our illustrations, by the way, and when she came up with her first illustration of what it would look like if, she thought, well, what if, the cyborg, what if Clint Eastwood was a cyborg? And so I was like, no, that isn't a very good metaphor. I think you ought to use people that are into Magnificent Seven. Clint Eastwood isn't even in the movie. I said, I think you should use, Steve McQueen, he's in the movie. And so she came up with this, and I'm like, I don't want him with a pink shirt. And she pointed out he actually wears a pink shirt in the movie. And I actually tried to watch the movie just so you know, and she was right. But before I could get back to her and say, hey, you're right, she already came up with this one. But just so you know, the reason why I think Steve McQueen represents the disappearance really well, this isn't not even a Western movie, right? It's not even a cowboy movie. It's The Great Escape. If you haven't seen The Great Escape, you should really watch that movie. And by the way, if you haven't seen The Magnificent Seven, I don't know. I don't know if you want to watch it. I tried watching it again, actually 3 times. I did finally get through it the 3rd time. But I fell asleep the first 2 times. What you got to realize is when I was that little boy in the 70s, there was only 3 stations on TV. And so I think my maybe I had a little bit, lower standards then or something, or I don't know. But I didn't find it as exciting as I remember it to be when I was a kid. And so I wouldn't recommend that you watch The Magnificent Seven. There's a different movie I'd recommend you watch. And by the way, one of them is The Great Escape. This is still worth watching, if you ask me. But back to the reason why we're here. The disappearance is causing some issues. It's also creating some opportunities, right? We're a lot more productive now than we were when we had to spend 2 hours getting ready to go into the bank and back home. But there are still, remote security issues. Hopefully we got all those addressed thanks to the pandemic. But productivity issues, morale issues, there's a lot of issues arising out of the disappearance. So this is why we want to consider the disappearance as we do our technology planning. Now, these 7 trends are kind of interestingly interactive too, by the way, and you're going to start seeing this as I walk through the talk here. But suffice it to say, one of the opportunities that's coming out of the disappearance is all the new technologies that we can be adopting because we can go to the cloud, because we're outsourcing that risk of doing some cool things to whoever is providing those services in the cloud and that sort of thing, right? And so the second trend, though, is that I'm noticing a lot of bankers getting anxious about the fact that they have gotten behind on adopting new technologies. And I'm kind of the guy who always kind of reminds people that maybe that's a good thing, not a bad thing. But, when it comes to new technologies and what do I mean by pen up a demand for new technologies, there's really 4 different offshoots from that. There's the new products and services that really drives all this, because if we get a new service, we get a new process, we're probably going to bring in a new vendor. It's probably going to require new methods, and we're probably going to have to address new controls. And the list of this makes a real long list of what we need to prioritize when we develop our technology plan, right? When we update our technology plan, there's a whole bunch of new stuff we need to consider. The word new is all over the place in our technology plan. When it comes to new technologies, there's a lot of unintended consequences. As an example, I don't know if you noticed, but Facebook ended up being criticized because unbeknown to Facebook, their neural networks were queuing up weapons to people that were discussing going to protests. Neural network, whatever. Unintended consequences of machine learning, neural networks, and artificial intelligence is what a cybersecurity guy like me is worried about. But what an operations person, what a CIO might be worried about is, are we getting behind on that? Are we getting behind on the cloud infrastructure, on NAC, or on identity access management, on fraud prevention? We're worried about these new technologies. Products and services, there's so many out there we can choose from. We're seeing our peers implementing some to great success and others to not so good success, and the juices in our belly are starting to secrete acid because we're starting to worry about the fact that our competitors are offering financial planning services, and we're hearing about inbound marketing and customer relationship management and all that kind of stuff, and we're worried that we're falling behind. And then likewise, some of us have to get new vendors just because we're still following through on what we said we were going to do before the pandemic. And, we're going to have to go out and lasso our vendor owners and make sure that they remember that the vendor management program is there for a reason. But the point being is we have new methods that we're starting to figure out. When are we going to get that done? How are we going to integrate that into our technology plan? The physical security people are talking about, physical security information management systems and new surveillance systems and lobby control systems and identity management systems. And wow, we're starting to think that maybe it is time to circle back around to network segmentation and some of the other things that come, when we want to step up to the plate and go to that next level of maturity when it comes to cybersecurity. New controls always end up being the result of new anything, right? Now, I have to say, I was really disappointed when the new guidance, both the authentication guidance from August, but the AIO from June, kind of really missed the opportunity to do something about MFA. Now, I was at an examiner panel in late October where the examiners all said that the big exam hot topic next year is going to be MFA for all admin accounts. But then they said, you should be ready to talk about it in your next examination. So that tells me that expectation might be a little bit soft. But I tell you, the thing that's going to really drive MFA for admin accounts is that the insurance companies that insure banks and even companies like Infotex for cybersecurity, that cybersecurity insurance, they're starting to require MFA on all administrator accounts or they won't insure you. And so interestingly, I think that's going to be the driving force. And by the way, it's not just the good guys that are using the new technologies, right? I mean, we've got fleeceware, fileless malware, better databases, more information available on the dark web. Open source intelligence has been around for quite a while now, but the bad guys are learning how to use it to find who they want to go after or whatever in your bank's customer locations. And then, of course, it's not just the good guys that are using this artificial intelligence and big data tactics and all that sort of thing, too, right? The hackers are using it as well. All this is coming to bear on our technology plans because we as bankers are totally keen to the fact that we can't implement anything new without measuring, responding to, and monitoring the risk of that new thing, right? And so vendor management is going to be a priority in these next couple of years if we're going to, do a better job of managing supply chain risk and the risk that comes with new stuff. And then finally, we need some management awareness training before the next technology planning session, because if you think you're anxious about our competitiveness, our management team's even more anxious. They're worried we're falling behind. They might even be saying this to us. When you have to shoot, don't talk, shoot, right? That's what Tuco said in The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. If you don't remember that scene, then go watch the movie again. The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, definitely worth watching again, by the way. And so this is what our management team is saying, right? And what we could do is we could bring this metaphor to our management teams and we could say, hey, you remind me of Tuco, when you have to shoot, don't talk, shoot, right? But Tuco was called the Ugly for a reason, right? And if we just run out and deploy this stuff without measuring and managing the risk, then that's going to get ugly. Now, it's probably not a good idea to use that kind of metaphor with your management team. And so what I would suggest you do is you just pull out a sheet of paper and you draw this same chart that I've been drawing for years now. It's based on Everett Rogers' book, The Diffusion of Innovations Theory from 1962. I had to read this book as part of a computer class, or I don't even remember what class, in college. I didn't like it then, but I've been using it ever since. And Everett Rogers brought us the language that we've been using, but also more importantly, he's the one that pointed out the obvious, which is as time goes on, the price and problems associated with the technology comes down as the features and sophistication associated with that technology get better. And whenever I draw this, people always say, it goes without saying. A lot of times I won't point out, yeah, but I had to say it. I won't point that out all the time, though, and I'm not saying you should, But what you want to do is you want to just remind management that what this does is this gives us the ability to declare where we want to be programmatically. Do we want to be, late majority or early majority, which is where most banks are. I have a lot of clients, smaller community-based banks, that they don't like the term laggards, but they will admit that they want to be the last to adopt any technology. Some of them are still implementing mobile banking now, right? And we do have a couple larger banks who are early adopters of technology, and there are some cases where we've seen some innovators in the banking space, especially on the security side of things, right? But the bottom line is your management team might recognize this graph a little bit better, which basically says, hey, we don't want to be in the first half, or we do want to be in the first half of the banks that adopt this technology. And we just want to remind our management team of this. I try to do it every time we walk into a technology planning situation with the bank. I like to go over this graph because it takes some of the anxiety away. Because guess what? Our competitors, they experience a lot more problems than we did, right? They experience, if the big banks, their customers are really irritated with them, right? The little banks, we got a really good deal. And we got some really good features. We didn't have to be the beta testers for it, right? And so the takeaways I have related to this, believe it or not, is a postmortem review. The first purpose it serves is that it sets up for your management team the lessons and the action items that come out of the scariest thing that's happened since the pandemic, in my opinion, and that is the supply chain attack, right? It happened again with Microsoft Exchange, so I'm pretty sure it's not going away soon. But the second thing it does is it shows your management team what a postmortem review should look like, or what it could look like. And so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, especially the what happened session. That's the part you're tired of. But you might want to take a look at the lessons learned, and more importantly, you might want to take a look at the action items. And so what I want you to know is that postmortem review is organized in terms of vendor management lessons, incident response lessons, and management lessons. And so let's learn from one of the most instructive incidents of the 2020s at least, and I know that's kind of cheating, but let's learn from a very instructive incident before we start our technology plans. The third, and probably most important trend, is best illustrated in this diagram. And just so you know, I don't know what Joe did, but Jane ain't happy with him, but she's got it under control from her perspective because Joe can't get out, right? And so if you think about it, Joe knows the combination to the safe, but he doesn't have the key to the cage. And so he's a victim of multi-factor authentication, right? And so, multi-factor authentication everywhere is the trend I want to talk about. But the trend that a lot of community-based banks are still talking about is we should get going and get that MFA on our VPNs, on our remote access, on cloud computing. I'm saying you should even think about applying it everywhere you can at least, okay? And at least start with the cloud computing sites. And so if you're putting information out in the cloud, your asset owners need to turn on MFA. Most cloud computing sites are offering MFA. We just have to turn it on. Imagine, what do you say about your customers that opt out of using multi-factor authentication on your cash management systems? You think they're kind of dumb, or I don't know if you think they're dumb, but you probably think they're accepting a lot of risk. And so we at least need to get our asset owners to, go out there and turn on MFA on the cloud. But then beyond that, we really need to start looking at MFA internally. On Windows, it's not that expensive. It's kind of a pain in the butt, but it's not that expensive. And so maybe we choose, certain accounts. Maybe our administrator Windows accounts all have MFA on it. Maybe those users that keep getting caught clicking on links, maybe they have MFA on their systems. I'm sure there's good ways in your bank to prioritize where you're going to roll out MFA when you implement your version of MFA everywhere. Okay. A lot of our clients are starting some pretty cool stuff. It's not just Windows, right? We have PowerShell. And so I've got some clients that are restricting PowerShell to specific hardened workstations that are in their data center, so they're protected physically, they're protected digitally, they're very hardened. So now we have kind of multi-factor authentication. What you have is access to that workstation, what you know is the password, et cetera, et cetera. Internal certificates, hardware keys, et cetera, are ways we can go with that. I don't want to spend a lot of time on MFA or endpoint and cloud security, because I can imagine that you've been hearing about that since the pandemic started, right? But I want to use this metaphor because I love this metaphor, which is it's not like we can just put everything behind the gate. We just can't put it all in the corral and say it's safe now, right? It's more like we have kind of a hotel, you know what I mean, instead of a bank. And so this is the way it used to be. You know, we used to have a situation where everything was behind a firewall, right? All our protected assets were behind a firewall, and our user was behind a firewall whenever they used information assets, right? Now it's all kind of nice and safe. You know, auditors like me got a little bit, concerned when we started using cloud assets, because we're like, hey, the data's over here, blah, 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 right? But that's the way it was. Then the pandemic struck, and we added all this attack surface to the equation. Not to mention the fact that a lot of us are still fooling ourselves thinking that employees are going to dial all the way in and go to these cloud assets from within our internet. But we need to be honest with ourselves and realize that it's going to work a lot better if they just go directly to the cloud assets from the endpoints, meaning that we better secure those endpoints better than we might have thought we needed to. Okay? And I mean, what we really have here is kind of a John Wayne thing, right? John Wayne could have said, we ain't circling the wagons, Pilgrim. We're lining them up and spreading them out, right? He didn't say that, and I obviously have a terrible John Wayne voice. The point being, though, is that we're expanding our attack surface. And so right now, most community-based banks are no longer pretending. We're doing some kind of manual auditing. We might even, be scanning endpoints, over the internet and that sort of thing. Right now, we're kind of in the early majority phase of adoption of some pretty good endpoint security applications, and community-based banks just can't afford that yet. And I'm talking about these applications here, Carbon Black and SentinelOne, Kaspersky. We've seen Semantics endpoint security application. Sophos has a really good one, but it's still in the early adopter phases, maybe the early majority. We might be reaching 26, 20, 28%, 20, 30% of people that will eventually adopt endpoint security. And so between now and then, though, we can still implement scanning on a very reasonable basis, where Infotex uses Tenable.io, and all endpoints are scanned on a periodic basis, according to our vulnerability management program, which is prioritized based on user and that sort of thing. If they're going out and auditing banks on a regular basis, you scan more often, that sort of thing. And it makes sure that we're patched. And the key to this, of course, is you have to have a program in place to make sure that whatever you found, or whenever you find in a scan gets addressed. And, we all know that where that's heading, by the way, is network access control. I'll be talking about that in a future trend here. But cloud security is another part of the equation. And this is not like, this is not the more of a maturity. This is kind of more of a, we start off with vendor management. And then part of that is make sure to have MFA, and then we want to make sure MFA gets applied before we start putting assets or putting information into the cloud. But hoping that we're all circle back around and running that cloud against some kind of an audit checklist to make sure we're at least trying to configure things safely. I'm assuming that the cloud provider is offering that. And the main thing out of that we're concerned about at Infotex is we want to make sure we're getting logs from any cloud application into the SIEM. We want them logs in the SIEM, right? We need that context. The cloud's part of our context. It's part of what we're trying to baseline, right? And then finally, gosh, I sure hope that you're providing awareness training before we actually start using the cloud application, if for no other reason, to make sure people know how to use the MFA and to report if the MFA isn't working. MFA very often turns itself off for some reason in certain situations. I know everybody's seen that. If you use OWA with MFA, that happens, at least twice it's happened at Infotex, where, you go to log into OWA and the MFA isn't working. What the heck? You know what I mean? And so, I will say that we really need to, at least for the cloud, move to a point where if they don't offer multi-factor authentication, then we don't want any confidential data there. We need to have a talk with our management team, and you're welcome to bring this up and use this metaphor, but that monkey, the only reason why that monkey is trapped is because he won't let go of the banana. And I call this the American monkey trap. Way too often, management wants the technology, and then they complain that they're trapped because of the technology. And so we need to let go of the banana until they offer the, I mean, my metaphor is breaking down now, but until there's no longer a chain, attached to the cloud asset. And so my takeaways for this, I actually have a couple of them. First of all, there's a manual endpoint audit checklist that you can use to, get the process started if you're still not manually auditing your endpoints. Again, if they're outside the bank, you need to audit them on a regular periodic basis to make sure that the patches are getting applied, that the antivirus stats are getting updated, that they're not, putting data on the endpoint, that they're not memorizing credentials in the browsers, all the stuff that would happen if you were going to a more mature endpoint security situation. And then finally, we also have a cloud security audit checklist, which is just a checklist you can use every time you implement a cloud application to at least see if there's different, security settings that you can have your asset owner turn on. The fifth, and probably the most important, in my opinion, trend that management needs to get their arms around before you have them write their next technology plan is that we need to start looking at things from a different perspective. We just need to look at things in a different light, in a different view. We already have a lot of different perspectives that we can choose from. There's a few new ones cropping up, the new version of the cat that the ABA is trying to push. A lot of banks are starting to move towards the NIST cybersecurity framework. It's being updated, right? The CIS controls, they're the top 20 controls. If you're a community-based bank and your examiner is starting to ask you to look beyond the cat, I'd look here. And it's not just 20 controls, by the way. There's a bunch of sub-controls. You need to be group 2 if you're going to adopt the CIS control, at least group 2. And then, we've got some that are pertinent to right now, right? If you're a state bank, there is a good chance that your DFI has adopted the RSET, which is a great framework that will help your management team feel more confident that that scary ransomware threat is being addressed. In fact, you really ought to consider implementing the RSAT even if you aren't a state-regulated bank. Now, in August of 2021, the FFIEC published a new authentication guidance for those who ignored the first two. And I say that because there is really nothing new in that new guidance. It's just a summary of what's already gone before. What is new and sweeping, according to the examiners at the panel I recently attended, is the AIO guidance. This 164-page booklet replaces the operation manual from 2004. It proves that the FFIEC believes we should update our policies and procedures at least once every 20 years, even if nothing has happened. Okay, that might be what we call get a wiggle on back in the old days, right? A little bit of sarcastic humor. Obviously, the FFIEC wants us to update our policies and procedures annually, even if it took them 17 years to update their manual. But it's not going to be easy. There will be a new policy. You're going to need to write an architecture plan, and then there's going to be a whole slew of gaps that'll need to be risk ranked. And by the way, we have a gap analysis I'll be speaking to in just a minute here. Most importantly, it's going to take cooperation and, yes, some patience. You see, we're really going to have to circle the wagons on this, and we want to be sure we don't leave the compliance people fit to be tied, using an expression from the 1800s. So we've included some takeaways that should help you get started in this regard. There's a gap analysis and some policy and procedure boilerplates. There's even a sample architecture plan. And it's not just banks that are adopting new perspectives. At Infotex, we're starting to use what we call a SOAR model. I don't want to go into it in too much detail. I'd love to talk to you about it because it's, it's shop to us, right? But there is one common paradigm shift that I'm hearing a lot of us talk about, and that is that maybe we should start acting as if we've already been breached. But the point being is that this is where the whole zero trust concept is coming from. And I'm going to be really quick in telling you what I think it is. And this is a pretty good metaphor, in my opinion, for zero trust. Okay? I mean, do you remember this scene? I mean, Jane wasn't there. This was Clint Eastwood, right? The good, the bad, and the ugly. Or actually, the good, the ugly, and the bad is the way this is drawn. But that's zero trust. I mean, to the point where we don't trust nobody, nothing. I mean, Tuco didn't trust anybody when we were in this scene, right? I like to explain zero trust this way, okay? And again, I like using metaphors. And so way back in the olden days, right, we used the metaphor of the onion and we talked about layered security, right? And just so you know, I mean, the olden days ended in 2009 because that was when Forrester, and you know, I've got something to say about Forrester there, but what you always hear people say is Forrester coined the phrase zero trust, and this is how they defined it. It's a little bit different than the way you'll see most people define it now, other than these three key words here: users, assets, and resources. I want you to focus on those three words there. But before we go into why, I just want to point one thing out. It wasn't really Forrester that coined the phrase. It was a guy named John Kinderbog who worked for Forrester at the time. I hope I'm pronouncing his name right because I love his blog, and he's the guy that coined the phrase. So I just wanted to point that out. But fast forward to 2021, and this is kind of what we got, right? There's no one onion that has, you know, I mean, we've got all kinds of onions, right? And you know, I mean, what was once a castle is now a hotel, right? Or putting all your cattle in one pen and then watching the pen no longer works, is what Cowhand Dan would say, right? Our porous networks can no longer be seen as an onion. And so I would really strongly encourage you to get out the NIST guidance on zero trust. And I'm not going to go over all of these tenets today. Somebody on your team, somebody technical, should understand these tenets. I feel like this is where a lot is going. I feel like network access control and identity management and multi-factor authentication are going to be old news real soon. Now, we're still in early adopter phases. We might be in the early majority phases of network access control. We're definitely in the early adopter phases of ICAM, of identity access management. So I feel like the best way to describe zero trust, and this isn't the complete methodology, but to me the best way to at least help management understand zero trust is in this high-level summary of it. And so to me, it goes back to those three words. Now I changed asset to device because I feel like that makes better sense, because there's users that need access to a resource and they use devices, and the devices themselves actually access that resource, okay? And so what zero trust is really about is the intersection of these three circles here. And really, I think the best way to explain that is that in order for a user to have access to a resource, there's really four things that need to be checked. A, does the user have permission to access that resource in this session? And that's a really important part, underline, in this session. And then, does the user use this device? And then the third is, does the device have permission to access the resource in this session? And then finally, the fourth thing is this device complying with the policy that we have in place that basically prohibits access to the resource unless the device is in compliance with the policy, which, by the way, is where NAC comes in. Network access control is where we make sure the device has the antivirus stats on it. It's got the right patch level on it. You know, it has all the endpoint security provisions that need to be in place before we're going to let it have access to this resource. And again, in this session, if the device disconnects and it goes to reconnect, we're going to check that again. We're going to check all four things again. And so if you think the traditional complexity was, does the user have permission? Okay. And that's 2 times 1 or 2. Zero trust complexity is those 4 different things that have to be checked, permutated, or the complexity is 24. It's 12 times the complexity traditionally. Now, we spent a lot of time in this talk talking about multi-factor authentication, which doubles your complexity, okay? So imagine the increased security if we multiply our complexity by 12 times. Well, what you're probably also imagining is the increased problems that come with that increased complexity. The increased calls from management upset that they don't have access to the resource because their device is not complying with policy or whatever, right? So the complexity, with security comes inconveniences. And so that's the balancing act that needs to happen. But zero trust is just a part of acting as if we've been breached. We've, seen a lot of breaches. And so I know what people act like when they're in a breach. And we don't trust anybody or anything. I agree, zero trust is definitely a part of acting as if we've been breached. Zero trust. But we also, first thing we do, I think, is we go out and we change the password on all the administrator accounts. And so if we were using weak passwords, betcha we're using stronger ones now, right? When we're breached, we strengthen all the administration authentication. And so why not do that now? That if we're going to act as if we're breached, there's a low-hanging fruit. Really, I would rather do that before we've been breached than after we've been breached, right? Another thing we do is we segment off the networks that we know haven't been touched by the bad actors, by the threat actors, right? So why not implement network segmentation now? If we're acting as if we've been breached, we would, of course, be segmenting our networks now. A lot easier said than done, I realize that, but where are we going to put this into the technology plan? Does this come higher priority than bringing in that latest and greatest neural network that we don't even know how it's going to work, right? Let's segment our networks before we use neural networks. Just saying. I don't know if you're aware of it, but they call it DFIR, Digital Forensics Incident Response. And I hear a lot of people saying, well, we can't do that because our insurance is going to pay for the forensics. Well, I've seen a lot of breaches. I'm actually kind of upset to tell you that not every forensics provider an insurance company pays for is good. And so I would be getting into a relationship with a forensics provider right now. I'd find out what their lowest retainer fee is and pay that just so you have that in place. Because you're going to want to have a second set of eyes. You're going to want to have a second opinion when that insurance company's forensics provider comes in and starts saying things about what happened to your network. But when you're in a breach, you're meeting with your MSSP several times a day. Now, we don't want you meeting with us several times a day, but why aren't you meeting with your MSSP or your SOC regularly? That's what you're going to do when you're breached. Start doing it now. Acting as if we've been breached is a really good thing. And then meanwhile, not only is awareness heightened, I'm telling you, it's intense. I'm a purveyor of awareness, right? I mean, awareness is 9/11 to the battle. And awareness is not only heightened during a breach, nobody's going to get away with nothing during a breach. Our awareness is heightened. I mean, this is acting as if we've been breached, right? Right? I mean, if you've seen the movie The Good, the Bad, and Ugly, you know exactly what we're talking about here. We're talking about the sweat coming off the brow of Tuco there. Acting as if we've been breached is something we can do now. So in the takeaways, I've got that in this special publication. I strongly, out of all of our takeaways, well, I don't know, that SolarWinds review is a pretty good one, but I would take a look at that in this special publication and make sure that at least one technical person on your team is aware of where zero trust is heading. And speaking of awareness, the seventh trend really is that we apply awareness in all directions. And so in the 1970s, when I was a cowhand on a farm, and just so you know, we actually had my dad and my uncle were Hadaway Brothers was the name of the farming operation, and they had two different farms, each with 100 head of cattle. And then the 100 head of cattle would be bred every year. We would end up with 100 steers and heifers, and we would take them to market. And taking them to market is where the farmers would learn about cattle, right? And so, you know, by the way, the theme of that conference, we were talking about prospecting and getting nuggets of information. And suffice it to say, there's a lot of nuggets of information that you can get by going and visiting your exhibitors. There's a lot of nuggets of information that you've written down as you've listened to these talks. And we need to organize those nuggets of information and make our management team aware of them. I actually, if you remember me saying, I founded Infotex in the year 2000, and we actually canceled a workshop on information security that was scheduled for September 12th, 2001. And ever since then, I've been saying that awareness is 9/11 to the battle. Because if you think about it, we were far more secure the day after 9/11, if you're old enough to remember, than we were the day before 9/11. Far more secure. And it was only awareness that established that security. If you're wondering why, if those of you who don't remember 9/11, if you're wondering why you take your shoes off every time you go into an airport, it's because American citizens tackled a guy on an airplane who they suspected had a bomb in his shoe. That was awareness, and awareness alone protecting us. I've been talking about awareness. I've been using the phrase awareness is 9/11 to the battle ever since then. And over the years, I've realized that there's really 3 interactive processes that a bank uses to make sure that their team is aware. Okay? We educate them, we motivate them, and we activate them. And what do I mean? Well, our acceptable use policy, or your IS policy, that policy you use to teach your employees the controls that users must enforce in order for us to remain safe, that's education. But it's when we help them understand why they take their shoes off in an airport, or when we help them understand why they shouldn't click on any old link. That why is the motivation. They're bankers. They want to protect their customers. If they understand why a control is in place, now they're motivated to enforce that control. And then finally, we need to activate their awareness. We need to keep them on guard. So when we do a social engineering test, if you're using know before or an application phish me or something like that, that's what you're doing. You're activating their awareness. Every time even if they now know what a know before phish looks like, you're still giving them a little bit of a reminder when they receive that message, right? The activation of their awareness is so important. Twice in my career, the person who hired our company to do the social engineering test failed the test. 2 different people. By the way, they're both retired now. It just occurred to me as I was getting ready to tell you about them. And those 2 people failed the test. They were educated about, both of them, by the way, were pretext calls. They were educated. They were motivated. They're spending money on it, right? But they weren't on guard. They didn't know that we had the gall to call them. And they failed the test, right? And so the activation of the awareness is just as important. And this is actually in place. You might not have this formalized, but you're doing this in your bank. You're telling the policy, and you're helping them understand why, and you're trying to remind them. You're trying to put them on guard, right? How is it working? Joe and Jane aren't really that confident that it's working well. And so I would like to introduce a metaphor that I think will really help you take your awareness to the next level, that will help you maybe not make your awareness intense. Maybe that's a little bit too far, but we want to at least have heightened awareness, and we want to have the ability to heighten it when we suspect something's going on, right? And so I feel like what banks are starting to realize is that we need to apply awareness in all directions. Right now, we've just focused it in on the users, but we need to help our management team become aware of things like, late majority versus early majority. We want to make sure our board of directors is aware of how an incident response process unfolds. The oversight committee needs to be aware of what they're overseeing and why it works and that sort of thing. So we want to apply awareness in all directions. And so I have this metaphor that works a lot better with cornbread than flour, and you'll see why. Because when I used flour, that looked like cocaine. Just saying. Okay. And so if you think that a pitcher of water is awareness, and if this cornmeal, by the way, it's not cornbread yet, it's cornmeal. If that's the bank, what do you think this is in my metaphor? So water is the awareness, the flour or the cornmeal is the bank. Well, the fan is technology risk, right? I maintain that the pandemic kind of changed all that. I feel like this is technology risk now, right? A nice industrial fan. But the point being is that we've been kind of dripping. We actually use drip messaging in our training on how to, make people aware and activate. But we've been dripping water into the dough, right? Into the flour, into the cornmeal, right? But when we turn the fan on, it's going to keep some of it there, but it's going to blow the rest of it away, right? We need that cornmeal and water into dough. We need to knead it into dough. So I call that the dough metaphor for awareness. And there's a lot of things we can do to knead that awareness in. I mean, a lot of us are just providing it more often, and I'm not thinking that's the way to go. But, what about decreasing the audit cycle, at least on our pen testing and our social engineering tests? At Infotex, we went to pen testing all year round, and the reason why is because it keeps us on guard all year round. We did the same thing with social engineering. I don't know why, but for some reason, a normal human being will click on a link if they think there's a bad guy on the other end of it. But if they think there's an auditor on the end of it, man, they avoid that link like the plague. Now, I think the reason why actually is because the likelihood of an auditor is 100%. We know an auditor is going to be auditing us every year, whereas we're still kind of wondering if we're not staying under the radar of those bad guys. And then, I've been hearing examiners say, almost every examiner panel, that you need to go back to the basics of networking. Well, why not invite your auditors to go back and audit your basic networking controls again? When's the last time you had a configuration audit? When's the last time you audited some of the basic stuff? We're proceeding with a false sense of security if we're not reopening all of our, controls and reopening them to be subject to audit. But I found over the years that the best awareness exercise that there is, if you only could do one thing, it would be to get your board and your management team and your incident response team and your internal tech team and your SOC, your MSSP, the technology risk monitoring team plus management, to go through a good, solid, bona fide incident response tabletop test where you're having to notify your customers. That is the best awareness exercise. Now, let's change movies to the Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, because sometimes our management team, they accuse us of being Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. They were kind of nice guys, but they stole a lot of time, right? Or at least our management team members think we're stealing their time. And so, we need to address that. And the way we address that, by the way, is with the technology plan. So if you go out to my.infotex.com/cowhand, you'll be able to find those deliverables that I was revealing to you. But then also, I'd like to kind of just circle back around to the Magnificent Seven, to these 7 trends. And I did finally get through watching the whole movie. And I'm glad I did, because I don't want to end the talk with a scene from the Magnificent Seven, because what I realized after watching the movie the second time is that only 3 of the 7 survived the final showdown. The other 4 got shot dead. So that's not a good way to leave you, right? And so let's switch back to Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Do you remember the final scene in that movie? Because this is, I think, what we're shooting for. And so if you haven't seen Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, I'm going to blow the movie for you. because at the end of the movie, well, for one, they got chased out of America. The American banks finally implemented controls. They monitored their risk better, and Butch Cassidy and a Sundance Kid could no longer rob banks in America. So they went to Bolivia, of all places. And Bolivia has a little bit different approach towards bank robbers than America did. And suffice it to say, the jig is up is kind of some Western lingo. And, they went out with a blaze, right? And so I like this as a metaphor because I also think that management is finally realizing that it's not really about catching the thief. It's about causing him or her to try Bolivia instead of Utopia. And I realize a lot of you are like, what? Who? Utopia? Well, that's the bank, in my opinion. Banks are Utopia to us because you're small institutions, but you comply with best practices. And one of the best practices that you're forced to comply with that I hope you're kind of realizing these trends can help with is the technology planning. Having management write their own technology plan guided by you is usually a top-down and a bottom-up approach, right? That we're balancing the business plan and audit findings and things we have no control over, against what our users are pushing on us for and what we're learning at these conferences, what our competitors are doing, right? And so as we write that plan, I hope the management team just remembers that the disappearance plus the pent-up adoption of new technologies is causing us to apply MFA everywhere and revisit endpoint and cloud security as we try a different perspective, like acting as if we've already been breached. And that causes us to apply awareness in all directions. Well, since this is a movie, obviously we can't answer questions in real time. But if you do have any questions, be sure to send us an email at info@infotex.com. That's info@infotex.com. I would like to end with the answer to one question I bet a lot of people are thinking but are not wanting to ask, which is, who's drawing all those really cool drawings? And so I'd just like to introduce you to our graphic illustrator, Sophia Tafoya. She's drawn everything that you've seen in this. This is all original Infotex art. And we're very proud of her here at Infotex. And we owe Sophia a lot of thanks. I mean, she even redesigned this puzzle graphic from way back in 2000. Which brings me back to you. We owe you a lot of gratitude as well. And we really appreciate you attending this and any of our educational events. Please let us know what you'd like to see in future education. And never forget, awareness is 9/11 of the battle.